5. March 2007. Ramadi, Al-Anbar Province, Iraq. The house sat at the end of a narrow street in the Malab district, unremarkable in every way that mattered. Cracked concrete walls the color of dust, a rusted gate that scraped when it opened, a courtyard where a dead lemon tree stood like a skeleton against the night sky. Inside, 4 men sat in a room lit by a single battery-powered lamp, foul like they were drinking tea. They were not sleeping, though it was past 2 in the morning, because men in their profession rarely slept through full nights anymore. Fetek, one of them, a Syrian who went by Abu Hamza, but whose real name no one in the room knew, was writing in a notebook. He had been writing for over an hour. Fires. The notebook contained operational guidance for Al-Qaeda in Iraq fighters scattered across the province, instructions on movement, safe houses, weapons caches, and something else, something that had become a survival priority in the preceding 18 months. How to recognize the difference between American raids and British raids, and what to do when each one came. The guidance filled 3 pages. Frail. It was specific, detailed, and based on hard experience paid for in captured fighters and compromised networks. The Americans, Abu Hamza wrote, come in helicopters. They come at night. They come fast. 5 days. They hit one target and leave. You can hear them from kilometers away. The noise is enormous. If you hear helicopters, you have time to run or hide. Frickin' Taiwan drowned. If they do not know exactly where you are before they arrive, you will escape. Then he wrote about the British. The British do not come in helicopters. You do not hear them. 5. They are already in your neighborhood for days before they come to your door. They know your name. They know your routine. They know who visits you. 5,000 episodes of Dark. And the first sound you hear is your door coming off its hinges. By then, it is too late. He underlined the final sentence twice. Within 3 weeks, Abu Hamza would be in American custody. 5 degrees null. The notebook would be found in a follow-on raid by a different unit. Intelligence analysts would photograph every page and circulate it through coalition command networks. Fryer and senior officers in both the American and British Special Operations communities would read those 3 pages, with very different reactions. The Americans would be irritated. 5. The British would not be surprised at all. The guidance was not an outlier. It was a pattern. 5. Between 2005 and 2008, coalition intelligence teams recovered dozens of captured documents, interrogation transcripts, and intercepted communications that all said the same thing in different words. 5L. Al-Qaeda feared British special forces in a way they did not fear American ones. Not because British soldiers were braver or better shots, fine, but because the British fought a kind of war that Al-Qaeda could not predict, could not hear coming, and could not escape through the methods that worked against everyone else. This is the story of why that happened. Force, and what it revealed about 2 very different philosophies of how to hunt men who do not want to be found. Far from drowsy. To understand why Al-Qaeda learned to anticipate American raids, but never cracked the British approach, you must first understand the doctrines that shaped each force in the years preceding the Iraq War. 4 billion. The differences were not accidental. Far off. They were the product of entirely separate military histories that had taught fundamentally different lessons about what special operations forces were supposed to do. 5 American special operations in the modern era were built on a foundation of technological supremacy and overwhelming force, applied with surgical precision. 5. The intellectual architecture came from Vietnam-era MAC-V-SOG, was refined during the 1980s in Central America, and reached its mature form in the 1990s under the Joint Special Operations Command. 4 MANE. The model was direct action, high-speed insertion via helicopter, violent entry, objective secured within minutes, immediate extraction. Speed was paramount. 5. The enemy's decision-making cycle had to be disrupted so completely that resistance collapsed before it could organize. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and the Ranger Regiment trained endlessly in this model. 5 reels behind. They were superbly equipped, night vision technology that turned darkness into green daylight. 5 communications systems that linked ground teams to overhead surveillance platforms in real time. Helicopters capable of inserting entire assault forces onto target buildings in under 60 seconds. 5. The doctrine assumed correctly that American forces could dominate any tactical engagement if they could close with the enemy faster than the enemy could react. It worked. 5,000 examples in Afghanistan in late 2001, when small teams calling in precision airstrikes shattered Taliban formations. FRIAC. It worked in Iraq in 2003, when Special Operations Forces seized key infrastructure before conventional forces even crossed the border. And it kept working through 2004, 5, and 2005 as Task Force 714, the Black Special Operations Task Force hunting high-value targets across Iraq, conducted raid-after-raid for capturing or killing mid-level insurgent leaders at a pace that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. But the model had a weakness. It was loud, 49%. Not just acoustically loud, though the MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters that American Special Operations Forces preferred were audible from kilometers away. It was operationally loud, predictable, 5 ways detectable, and insurgents, who had nothing but time and every incentive to study their enemies' patterns, learned to read the signs. British Special Forces had learned a different lesson from a different war. Fraser. The SAS and SBS inherited their operational philosophy from Malaya, Borneo, Aden, and 30 years of operations in Northern Ireland. Fire. The lesson was simple and unforgiving. In a counterinsurgency, the side that controls information wins. Not firepower. Information. Knowing where the enemy sleeps. Firing. Knowing who brings him food. Knowing which house he will visit 3 days from now. And being there, silently, when he arrives. The British called it the deliberate approach. 5. American observers called it slow. Al-Qaeda would later call it something else entirely. 5. Where American doctrine emphasized speed of execution, British doctrine emphasized departments of preparation. An American raid might have 48 hours of planning behind it. 5 minutes. A British operation might have 3 weeks. Where American forces inserted by helicopter to minimize time on ground, British teams patrolled in on foot, sometimes spending days moving into position. 5 where American forces hit one target and extracted immediately, British forces established covert observation posts and waited sometimes for a week or more, gathering intelligence on an entire network before making a single arrest. Fire. The difference was cultural and institutional. The American military, built for conventional warfare against peer adversaries, had adapted its special operations forces to deliver precise violence faster than any enemy could process. 5. The British military, shaped by decades of small wars against insurgent adversaries, had adapted its special operations forces to become invisible, patient, and thorough. Neither approach was wrong. Fight. But when both were applied against the same enemy in the same environment, Al-Qaeda learned very quickly which one they could adapt to and which one they could not. 5K. By late 2005, the pattern was clear to anyone watching carefully. American Special Operations raids were kinetic, spectacular, and increasingly predictable. 4 British SAS operations were almost invisible, devastatingly effective, and utterly baffling to an enemy that relied on pattern recognition for survival. 4080. The question was whether anyone in a position to change American doctrine would notice before the insurgency adapted completely. Firework. And whether the British, operating in smaller numbers with less support, could sustain their approach long enough for it to matter. Fire. The answer to both questions would be written in the streets of places like Ramadi, Fallujah, and Basra over the following 3 years. Fire. And the men who would pay the price for those answers were already preparing for missions they did not yet know they would be ordered to conduct. Feldy. The American task force that hunted high-value targets across Iraq operated out of a facility the size of a small city. Fowls. Bagram Air Base, north of Baghdad, housed thousands of personnel, rows of helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, armored vehicles, and the most sophisticated intelligence fusion center in the theater. 14 Task Force 714 was enabled by technology that would have seemed like science fiction a generation earlier. Feprida and Reaper drones circled overhead 24 hours a day, their cameras feeding live video to analysts who tracked vehicles, mapped networks, and identified patterns. Friction. Signals intelligence platforms intercepted mobile phone calls and text messages in real time. Biometric databases compared fingerprints and retinal scans from detainees against watch lists, updated hourly. 42,000 kilometers. When a target was identified, the machinery of American Special Operations moved with devastating speed. Fire. A typical raid sequence looked like this. Intelligence identified a high-value individual at a specific location. 5 analysts confirmed the target's presence through multiple sources: overhead surveillance, signals intercepts, human intelligence from informants. A mission was planned, usually within 12 to 24 hours. Frassel teams boarded helicopters at Balad or another forward operating base. They flew to the target under cover of darkness, secured the objective in under 10 minutes, and extracted with prisoners or remains. Fine. The entire operation, from wheels up to wheels down, rarely exceeded 90 minutes. It was efficient. It was professional. It was also, from an insurgent's perspective, survivable if you paid attention. FAPE. The helicopters were the tell. The distinctive thump of rotor blades carried for kilometers in the still desert air. Frusk. Insurgent lookouts posted on rooftops in contested neighborhoods learned to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft and pass warnings via mobile phone or handheld radio. FAGREP. By the time American assault teams fast roped onto target buildings, high-value individuals with any tactical awareness had eaten already slipped out back doors, over walls, Firedale, into pre-planned escape routes that led through neighborhoods where American forces would not follow without significant backup. The Americans knew this. They adapted. 4. They added ground-blocking forces. They reduced the time between identification and action. 4,000 vibes. They developed techniques for sealing entire city blocks. But the fundamental problem remained. A helicopter arriving overhead was an announcement. 5 feet. And announcements gave the enemy time to respond. Task Force 714 compensated through volume. 5. If individual targets escaped, they simply hit more targets. In 2006 alone, American Special Operations Forces in Iraq conducted thousands of raids. The pressure on insurgent networks was real. Fire. But the highest value targets, the operational leaders who planned attacks and controlled financing, Ophetan remained frustratingly out of reach. They learned the pattern. They adapted their own procedures. They survived. Fipple. British Special Forces approached the problem from the opposite direction. 5+1. Where the Americans accepted helicopter signature as a necessary cost of speed, the British eliminated the signature by eliminating the helicopters. SAS and SBS teams inserted on foot, Ophetan days before an operation. Fire. They moved through the same streets, across the same terrain, in the same darkness that insurgents used. They became part of the environment in a way that a helicopter dropping out of the sky never could. Fire and test. Operation might begin with a single operator spending weeks developing a human intelligence network in a target neighborhood, not kicking down doors, talking, listening. Fine tea in shops, building relationships with tribal leaders who had reasons to dislike Al-Qaeda, firing the families that foreigners stayed with, learning which houses had recently installed reinforced doors or blackout curtains, noting when certain vehicles appeared or disappeared. Frax. This intelligence was then combined with technical surveillance, hidden cameras, listening devices, pattern of life analysis to build a comprehensive picture of a target's routine. Not just where he was tonight. 5. Where he would be next week, who he met with, where he felt safe. 5. When the SAS finally came, they came in a way that gave no warning. 4 or 6 operators moving on foot through darkness so complete that even night vision struggled to penetrate it. No vehicles, no helicopters, frail VU, no acoustic signature beyond the sound of boots on dirt, and those boots were chosen specifically for silence. Freya, the first indication that an operation was underway was the explosive breach of a door, and by then, the target was already surrounded. The contrast was not lost on the insurgents. 5. In early 2006, British forces in Basra conducted Operation Sinbad, a deliberate effort to dismantle Al-Qaeda and Shia militia networks in the city. 5%, the operation combined conventional patrols with SAS direct action missions. Over 4 months, British Special Forces conducted dozens of raids. Frail. The success rate was staggering. A FETA target was captured or killed with almost no warning, reaching the wider insurgent network. 5. Intercepted communications from that period showed confusion among Al-Qaeda operatives. They could not identify the pattern. They did not hear helicopters. They did not see convoys. 5. One captured fighter described the British approach in an interrogation transcript as like ghosts. He elaborated, "The Americans, you can prepare for. You hear them. 5th, you know they are coming. The British, they are already there." The doctrinal difference extended beyond insertion methods. American raids prioritized speed and violence of action. Doors were blown off hinges with explosive charges. 4 rooms were cleared in seconds. Anyone who moved wrong was shot. The emphasis was on overwhelming the objective so completely that resistance was impossible. It worked. It also meant that intelligence gathering was secondary to neutralizing the target. British raids prioritized intelligence collection. Yes, doors were breached. Yes, force was applied. But the first priority was securing everyone in the building alive if possible, then exploiting the site for information. Every mobile phone was imaged. 5 papers was photographed. Detainees were questioned on site before being moved. 5. The entire operation was designed to extract maximum intelligence that would enable the next operation, and the one following that. This difference produced a compounding effect over time. 47 million men. American raids disrupted networks. British raids dismantled them. An American operation might capture a cell leader and feel the network regenerate around a replacement within weeks. A British operation would capture the leader, firers, identify his communications network through phones and documents found on site, then roll up the next 3 layers of the organization through follow-on operations that the enemy never saw coming. 4. A sergeant in the SAS described the philosophy in a private interview years later. The Americans wanted to kill or capture high-value targets. We wanted to understand and destroy entire networks. Killing one bloke does not win. Times understanding everyone he worked with and removing them all at once. That wins. By mid-2007, the pattern was clear enough that American commanders began requesting British Special Forces for operations in areas where insurgent leadership had proven especially elusive. One such request came from Ramadi. Just a quick moment. Thank you for spending your time with me. If you've enjoyed this story and you'd like more like it, please subscribe to Saber Squad. It genuinely helps the channel, and it keeps these accounts alive. Let's carry on. Ramadi in 2007 was the most dangerous city in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had claimed it as the capital of their self-declared Islamic State. The city was a fortress. 500 major route. Snipers controlled intersections. Fine combat. Outposts inside the city, but moving between them required armored convoys, and a Phaeton resulted in casualties. Firefighter in Iraq's Anbar operations was believed to be based somewhere in the Malab and Tamim districts. 5 American intelligence had identified several high-value individuals, but had struggled to pinpoint their locations long enough to action them. The problem was the same problem that plagued operations across the province. By the time helicopters arrived, targets had melted away into civilian neighborhoods where distinguishing insurgents from residents was nearly impossible. In April 2007, a joint task force was formed. American intelligence would provide targeting data and overhead surveillance. Fundrated British SAS would provide the direct action element. The approach would be British. No helicopters, foot insertion, patience, fire. The operation that followed would become a case study in the differences between the two doctrines and what those differences meant for the men on the receiving end. The target was a senior Al-Qaeda facilitator known as Abu Khalid, 500 pounds. He was responsible for coordinating suicide bombing operations across Ramadi and had been linked to at least 14 attacks that had killed American soldiers. 5 Intelligence placed him in a compound in the Malab district, but his pattern of movement was erratic. He rarely stayed in the same location more than one night. Far. The Americans proposed a raid, identify his location, insert by helicopter, hit the target within 2 hours. Fly. The British proposed something else entirely. Saturate the neighborhood with covert observation, map his network, and take everyone at once. The British approach won. 4 SAS teams inserted into Malab over the course of a week. They did not arrive in helicopters. 5 legs. They walked in, dressed in a way that allowed them to move through the district without drawing attention. 2 operators posed as Iraqi civilians, 4 inches off. Others entered at night, moving through back alleys and over roofy tops to reach predetermined observation posts. For 6 days, they watched. They identified 3 separate safe houses that Abu Khalid rotated between. Far than far, they identified his security detail. They identified a pattern. Every 3rd night, he met with another senior figure in a specific building. On those nights, both men were in the same place for approximately 2 hours. On the night of April 23, 2007, both men were in that building. The SAS moved. The assault team consisted of 8 operators. They approached on foot from 4 different directions, moving through darkness without night vision for the final 200 meters to avoid the faint glow of the devices giving them away. They reached the compound walls simultaneously, climbed over, crossed the courtyard, and placed explosive charges on the door in under 30 seconds. The breach was loud. It had to be. But it was also the first sound anyone inside the building heard. There had been no helicopters, no vehicles, no warning. Abu Khalid was in a first-floor room with 3 other men when the door exploded inward, 40 feet away. He reached for a weapon. He was shot once in the shoulder, disabling him without killing him. The other 3 men were secured. 4 minutes of sight secured took under 4 minutes. The exploitation phase took 3 hours. Every phone was imaged. Every document was photographed. 4 backs a back room contained unencrypted files detailing the entire Al-Qaeda network in Anbar province. Names, locations, financial records, operational plans. It was an intelligence windfall. But the true value of the operation was not in what was found. It was in what happened next. First, the intelligence recovered from Abu Khalid's compound enabled 11 follow-on operations over the following 2 weeks. Each operation was conducted the same way. Foot insertion, covert observation, precision raid, 14 PCs. Each operation rolled up another layer of the network. By early May, Al-Qaeda in Iraq's leadership structure in Ramadi had effectively ceased to exist. Not because individual leaders were killed, though several were, but because the entire network was compromised. They had not heard the British coming. They had not had time to warn each other, and by the time they understood what was happening, it was already over. The American task force took notice. Requests for British SAS support increased. But the British operated in small numbers. There were perhaps 60 SAS operators in Iraq at any given time, compared to hundreds of American Special Operations personnel. They could not be everywhere, and their approach took time that American operational tempo did not always allow for. The doctrinal tension was real. American commanders wanted results now. British doctrine required patience to achieve lasting results. Both approaches had merit. But in the specific context of hunting adaptive insurgent networks, the patient approach produced something the fast approach could not: fear. Al-Qaeda fighters learned that American raids were dangerous, but survivable if you had a good escape plan and decent lookouts. The British. Because by the time the British came, it was too late to run. The clearest evidence of how Al-Qaeda perceived the two approaches came from captured documents and interrogations conducted throughout 2007 and 2008. The notebook found in Ramadi was not unique. 5. Similar guidance appeared in safe houses from Mosul to Basra. 5. The pattern was consistent. Detailed instructions for evading American raids, almost nothing useful for evading British ones. One document, recovered in Fallujah in late 2007, contained a section titled Recognizing the Enemy. It described American operations in clinical detail. Helicopters approach from the east where their bases are located, 5 to 10 minutes before they arrive. If you are in a target building, leave immediately through pre-planned routes. Do not engage. They will not follow on foot into civilian areas at night. Fire. The section on British operations was shorter and bleaker. The British do not announce themselves. If you are a target, assume they already know where you are. Maintain multiple safe houses. Never stay in one location more than 2 nights. Trust no one with your location except those who must know. If the British are hunting you specifically, leave the city entirely. Final line was telling. The guidance did not say, prepare to fight. It said leave. Interrogation transcripts revealed a similar pattern. Fire. American interrogators reported that captured Al-Qaeda fighters were effete and willing to discuss American raids in detail, sharing techniques they had used to escape or evade. Fair went. When asked about British operations, the same fighters of Eton became quiet. One captured fighter in Basra told his interrogator, "The Americans are soldiers. Fine. The British are hunters. You do not escape a hunter." The psychological impact extended beyond operational effectiveness. Fear is a weapon in counterinsurgency, and not the fear of overwhelming force which insurgents can rationalize and adapt to, but the fear of being hunted by an enemy that knows your name and is already in your neighborhood, watching. Fire. That kind of fear erodes networks from within. It makes fighters hesitant to meet in person. It degrades communication. It creates paranoia that American firepower alone could never achieve. 5 senior Iraqi intelligence officers, who worked with both American and British forces during this period, described the difference simply. Al-Qaeda respected the Americans. Fire that vaned the British. The respect came from American professionalism and firepower. The fear came from something older. 5%. But fear alone did not win wars. And by 2008, the broader strategic picture in Iraq was changing in ways that made the differences between American 5 and British approaches less relevant than the fact that both were part of a larger effort that was finally gaining traction. Fire. The Anbar Awakening, a movement of Sunni tribes turning against Al-Qaeda, had shifted the ground war decisively in coalition favor. American conventional forces, applying counterinsurgency doctrine learned painfully over the previous 4 years, were holding ground in ways they had not been able to before. 5. The surge of American troops in 2007 had provided the manpower to sustain operations that previous force levels could not support. 50 special operations raids, whether American or British, were a component of that larger picture. An important component, certainly. 5%. But not the only one. And as Al-Qaeda's networks collapsed under combined pressure from multiple directions, the question of which raids they feared more became less operationally significant. The lessons, however, remained. 5 and 30, where a different enemy in different terrain would force the same doctrinal questions to be answered all over again. 4 suppositions played out over the years that followed the Iraq surge. 5 American Special Operations Command absorbed some of the lessons from British operations, though institutional resistance remained strong. The idea that slower could be better, that patience could be more effective than speed, ran counter to deeply ingrained cultural preferences for action and decisiveness. Some American units adapted. The SEALs in particular began incorporating longer surveillance phases into their operations in Afghanistan. Delta Force developed hybrid approaches that combined American technological advantages with British patience. But the institutional default remained the helicopter raid, the fast insertion, the overwhelming violence applied with surgical precision. The British, for their part, continued operating the way they always had. Small teams, long preparation, human intelligence networks, patience, fire. The approach worked in Basra, worked in Helmand, and continued working in covert operations across the Middle East that remain classified to this day. The human cost of both approaches was paid in different ways. Fire. American Special Operations Forces lost men in firefights during raids. British forces lost men during the long, exposed periods of covert observation that preceded their raids. Fire. Neither method was without risk. The difference was where the risk was concentrated. American casualties tended to be sudden and kinetic. Helicopter crashes, ambushes during extraction, firefights on target. Probe. British casualties were often the result of patient operations going wrong. Observation posts discovered, covert patrols compromised, operators caught in situations where extraction was not immediately available. Fire foot and at the Joint Special Operations Command headquarters in North Carolina bear the names of men from both nations who paid the price for their respective doctrines. FET. The question of which approach was better cannot be answered by counting losses. Both worked. Both cost lives. 500. The real question was always contextual. What does this specific situation require? For Al-Qaeda networks in Iraq between 2005 and 2008, the situation required what the British provided. 5. A hunting methodology that denied the enemy their primary survival mechanism, which was pattern recognition and adaptation. Firing American raids could be studied and evaded. British operations could not because British soldiers were supernaturally skilled, but because their doctrine eliminated the predictable elements that insurgents relied on to survive. 5. By 2010, as both American and British combat forces began drawing down in Iraq, the special operations lessons learned were being encoded in training programs, doctrine manuals. 5. And classified AFITA action reports that would shape how Western militaries approached counterinsurgency for the next generation. Fire. Veterans of both approaches returned home carrying different memories of the same war. American operators remembered the controlled violence of raids conducted at speeds their enemies could not match. France. British operators remembered the patient hours in observation posts, the silent approaches through hostile streets, and the look on a target's face when he realized he had been compromised days ago and never knew it. Frack. And somewhere in the refugee camps and prisons scattered across Iraq, former Al-Qaeda fighters remembered both. They remembered the Americans as dangerous, professional, and predictable. 5. They remembered the British as something else entirely, as the thing that came without warning and could not be escaped. Fog. Those memories would outlive the war itself. The lesson Al-Qaeda learned about British special forces was not written in tactical manuals or training documents. Fire. It was whispered in safe houses and passed from veteran fighters to new recruits as a warning that carried the weight of hard experience. The British hunt differently. 5. The British are already in your neighborhood. The British know your name. 5. These were not the words of men who had been merely defeated in combat. These were the words of men who had been psychologically dismantled by an enemy that operated outside the tactical framework they understood. FET. American raids could be survived through discipline, preparation, and good escape routes. British operations could not be survived because by the time you knew you were being hunted, you were already caught. Flight. The deeper truth was not about superior British training or inferior American methods. It was about different philosophies applied against an enemy adaptive enough to exploit any predictable pattern. Physic. The Americans prioritized speed and shock. The British prioritized information and patience. Both approaches achieved their objectives, but only one approach created the kind of fear that degrades an organization from within. Firestone. There is a small memorial at Stirling Lines in Hereford, the SAS headquarters, that lists operations by date without detail. Farce. Some of those dates correspond to nights in Ramadi, Fallujah, and Basra, when operators walked into hostile neighborhoods and did not return until the job was Fire in the families who visit know better than to ask. In the final accounting, wars are won not by the soldiers who fight them, but by the strategies that guide them. 5 American Special Operations Forces had technology, firepower, and speed. British Special Forces had history, patience, and the willingness to become invisible in a way that modern armies had largely forgotten. 5 Al-Qaeda adapted to one and never cracked the other. Fight. What this revealed was not a hierarchy of effectiveness, but a reminder of what counterinsurgency has always demanded. The ability to fight not the war you want to fight, but the war the enemy forces you to fight. 5 Value targets faster than the enemy could replace them. The British wanted to dismantle networks so completely that replacement became impossible. 5 minutes. But when former Al-Qaeda fighters were asked years later which raids they feared most, the answer was always the same. Far fear to Menton, the ones they never heard coming, the ones where the first sound was their door exploding inward, and the last sound was British voices in the darkness telling them not to move. Firework creates. That is the fear of being hunted by someone who knows you better than you know yourself. Fire. And that fear, more than any number of successful raids, was what made the difference between disrupting an enemy and defeating one. The notebook found in Ramadi sits now in a classified archive. 5. The pages are faded, the handwriting is neat, and the final sentence, underlined twice, remains the truest thing Abu Hamza ever wrote about the war he was losing. By then, it is too late.